I think we're ready to move on to this main topic here on international exchanges. And this was actually incited by an article that we won't cover too much, but it was created by Token Market and a very good synopsis of how the jurisdictions across the world are looking at STOs and preparing and adapting. Over the last month or two, we've been talking about how the definition of securities and tokenized securities are being defined by regulators everywhere. And this is a great article that does a good synopsis of it. But really, we figured it might be useful for everyone to dive in even further, get even more coverage because this article doesn't cover everything that's happening, and more importantly, talk about what really matters, which is the exchanges coming to market in those jurisdictions, expecting to compete in the capital market level. But before we jump into what I'll call the world tour, Kyle, I think it's worth mentioning, why this topic is so important and
Right.
why this technology and the concept of tokenized exchanges, specifically being international, is so important for capital markets today. The first one, I think, is more or less obvious, which is that there is now a new market that's in a foreign jurisdiction where an asset could get listed. So let me give you an example where last week, I believe Kyle mentioned that INX is doing an IPO. And INX is actually, I believe, out of Gibraltar, and they are doing an F1 IPO in the United States. And that is them and raising $130 million. So that's a perfect example of a company who is looking outside their jurisdiction to try and find, at least in this case, primary investors and liquidity for their assets. And we can expect that this trend will continue as more and more international exchanges pop up all around the world. You now have issuers seeing that they can tap into new pools where obviously the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are very prohibitive for 99% of businesses. You have other regions like the Euronext and other exchanges around the world that have found a home for different types of commodities, currencies, or different specific assets. And now we will see even more exchanges become available for those issuers, maybe tapping into new asset classes that couldn't find liquidity on any exchange previously before, or simply making it easier to list in a foreign jurisdiction, and therefore the compliance or the costs, et cetera, is reduced. And it makes sense to then go ahead and actually, instead of listing in your home country, actually do a foreign listing.
Definitely.
The next one I think is also worth mentioning, of course, is the reverse side of that. You have the issuers looking at foreign jurisdictions. Now you have the investors. You just gave a great example in this episode, Kyle, where you could go and invest in a student housing real estate project in the UK. You could go and invest based on the La Estancia, into an opportunity into the Dominican Republic. Constantly every week, we're giving you examples of new foreign investment opportunities, not necessarily always available to the U.S., but the point being that you now, as an investor, as a result of international tokenized exchanges, have more access and easier access to new investment opportunities, new ROI, new alpha, which is always a good thing to make global capital markets more efficient.
This is also important on secondary markets. And a lot of investors today are really bound by the jurisdiction for secondary trading of traditional securities based off of their local jurisdiction. It is very difficult to buy or sell equities from outside jurisdictions than the one that you are located in. You need to leverage OTC desks or many other kind of roundabout solutions, and it's not quite as easy as just going on your brokerage site and buying something from the South Korean stock exchange. That doesn't work as effectively as one might be for buying in their local jurisdiction. And so for investors, primary investment as well as secondary investment, accessing it internationally is incredibly valuable.
Major.
Additionally, I think that we're talking about jurisdiction interoperability. So being able to invest around the world and be able to raise capital around the world is also valuable for the third piece of the puzzle, which is the regulations and the institutions themselves. And so the really key development in security tokens is the reality that when tokenized securities are standardized across these jurisdictions, it would allow for partnerships between exchanges with each other or exchanges themselves actually getting licensed in multiple jurisdictions in order to allow for their audience of investors, as well as allowing them to gain a larger audience of investors to participate, which were previously not accessible to them. And we're starting to see that we can break down these centralized financial barriers to allow for exchange-free asset exchange inside and outside of a jurisdiction. And so as long as we're establishing what these things are and making it clear what a security is and who's allowed to invest and quantify those things properly, there seems to be no reason why we can't have this interoperability between all of these different exchanges and all of these different regulatory bodies to be able to improve the experience for all investors.
Couldn't agree more, Kyle. I guess the difference between the two examples are, it's one thing for now anyone in the US or in the UK to be able to go and invest in Singapore directly. It's another to be able to go to your existing financial institution in your home country and have them purchase and buy in Singapore. It's a much more efficient system. It's going to be much more regulatory compliant, and it is making the process easier. It's probably more difficult to have to be a foreigner going into one of these exchanges, regardless of the fact that it's now a digital process. So I think it's a really good highlight. And with that, I think we've set the stage for us to go and travel the globe, and we'll start right here in Europe, where, for those of you listening, I'm from Belgium, so I think this is great for me to cover this region. And we're going to start with what is likely seen as the most progressive jurisdiction, the UK. Easily, because of their FCA sandbox and because of all the approvals on token market, Tokeny 2030, Global Cap, Smart Lands, you're getting tons of issuances coming out of that region. And it means that there's going to be a lot of activity to be expected on the secondary side. However, it doesn't seem like there are any major exchanges, let's call it startup entrants, such as T0 and the equivalent in the US, in the UK. So the major one that really is making moves is the London Stock Exchange, which has announced a deal to list the 2030 shares worth around $3 million. And they'll be listed, expected sometime around next year after their lockup expires. So that's great news to see, the institutional exchange working with these issuance platforms to go ahead and find liquidity. It's certainly much harder to develop a marketplace and much easier to work with an existing one and optimize it around your instrument.
Are the 2030 shares tokenized? Are you aware of what
Yes.
those shares? So they're tokenized shares.
Tokenized shares approved by the FCA that will be listed on the London Stock Exchange.
So that's cool. That's big news.
As far as we know, that will be the first example of that on really any exchange to date so far. I'm sure actually that one will sneak in there beforehand, depending on lockup situations, but I think that's a major deal. Moving on, the next kind of biggest jurisdiction, I think, making a name for itself, Kyle, is, of course, Malta. Malta is home to some major players, and Malta has kind of redefined itself as blockchain islands. They put out the VFA regulations. They recently put out another one around security tokens, and Binance, as well as OKX Exchange, have both done public partnerships with the Malta Stock Exchange to trade security tokens. And we know there's a lot of activity from issuance platforms like NewFund, Black Manta, and many more that are looking to find liquidity through the Malta jurisdiction. And Binance and OKX are two major cryptocurrency exchanges, right? Super large in
Huge volume.
So at the end of the day, this is a similar concept of you're not making a brand new marketplace, and Binance, doing billions in revenue, certainly has the capacity to put a lot of resources into developing this out in partnership with the Malta Stock Exchange. So that's going to be super exciting when that happens. We're all keeping a close eye on the island of Malta to see announcements from these exchanges about when they'll be live and which assets will be listed. And of course, we hope to be sharing that information with you weekly on our podcast. Next up, traveling over to Switzerland. The Swiss Stock Exchange launched the SDX, the Swiss Digital Exchange. Again, this is their institutional, national stock exchange that is looking at security tokens with great intensity. They partnered with R3 to start bringing everything on chain and using a specific distributed ledger technology that will be compliant with their regulations. And as a national exchange, once again, we expect to see big moves happening from this. It is a subdivision that they're launching out, but we know that they're already working with debt instruments, and one can expect to certainly see some of the major projects or projects we haven't heard of yet look to list on the SDX. Last week I did announce that their CEO, or 2 weeks ago, I'm not sure, I don't remember, stepped down. So they probably still have some ways to go before that's actually going to be happening.
I feel like most of these exchanges have a ways to go still before we really do see
that is definitely the trend. And the same can go for Gibraltar, which is home to 2 exchanges. The Gibraltar Blockchain Exchange and INX, which I just mentioned to you, is doing the IPO here in the US. Gibraltar Block Exchange raised $27 million in order to go ahead and launch their platform, and all eyes are on them for them to go live. And of course, INX is raising around $130 million in their IPO, so that gives you a little bit of a implication on the size that they're going for here. But once again, both are not live and trading security tokens, so it's hard to infer much more. I think this next one's really interesting, Kyle, out of France here. Another institutional stock exchange. This one actually happens to be the 6th biggest exchange in the world by market cap. Obviously, the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are bigger, but ultimately it's the same company, ICE, that also owns the New York Stock Exchange and the Euronext Exchange, which is why I find this so interesting. And Euronext made headlines when they announced that they are investing in issuance platform Tokeny. And Tokeny is actually one of our STG preferred partners, and they confirm that the expectation is for the Euronext to eventually be supporting tokenized securities. So I think that's a great move, and I just think it's very interesting that at the end of the day, if Euronext is able to do this successfully, there's no reason why parent company ICE won't look at this and see the success and hopefully maybe translate that over to the NYSE.
You have to think that they're behind this to a large degree. They're here in the U.S., they haven't fully ventured into tokenized securities or security tokens yet, but they are going live with Bakkt, which has to do with Bitcoin futures and a lot of crypto. So you have to think that they're starting to think about what this might look like in the U.S. and potentially scaling this even around the world eventually. So I totally agree. This is a huge vote of confidence from them in Tokeny as well as in security tokens in general. So this is a big one.
Fully agree. Liechtenstein, another European jurisdiction, actually also has 2 exchanges in it. Most people wouldn't have thought. One of them is called BlockTrade, which we of course mentioned earlier in the episode, being acquired by Cryptix AG. There is no news around when they are going to be live, but the other exchange, LSX, the Liechtenstein cryptocurrency exchange, or probably at some point the LSX, also has announced that they are looking at security tokens and expect to be in the game very soon. Now, very soon in again, terms of exchanges, likely not next quarter, likely not even this year, but one can hope and one can root for them for sure. Estonia, always recognized as a very forward-thinking, digital-friendly environment, launched a DX exchange out of Estonia, which also was popular when they announced that they would be matching NASDAQ stocks with tokens that would be purchasable on the DX exchange. I think they ran into some difficulties there and are no longer doing that, but they're partnered with Marketplace Securities, who will generate ERC20 tokens with corresponding rights to the stocks. And the concept is that you can buy these tokenized securities through the DX, as opposed to, as we mentioned to you, going through the difficulty in the process of trying to go to the US markets and purchase them there directly. So very interesting move, and I'm sure that they will expand themselves to be able to list other types of securities and the like, although that's not confirmed, at least not on our side. So DX exchange out of Estonia, one to keep your eyes on. The last region in Europe that we're going to cover right now is Belarus, where they have currency.com, launching a tokenized securities exchange aiming to facilitate the adoption of security tokens around the world, live with a token issuance that essentially very similarly mirrors traditional securities in the US market. They'll be working with their sister firm Capital.com, which is another platform regulated by the FCA, as well as also the CySEC, the Cyprus Securities and Exchange Commission, to offer users access to a tokenized version of these equities, commodities, or indexes. So another trend that we're seeing here, Kyle, specifically in Europe, and reinforcing what we were just saying, right? European investors want access to U.S. Assets.
It's a very interesting idea that you can take a cryptocurrency and relate it one-to-one with a purchased stock from the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. And because those are tied together, it would mirror the same returns as long as there's the legally binding contract between the two. It's an interesting idea. It is a security token because you're talking about an asset-backed token. And I think it's a great start because it's something that investors can easily wrap their heads around, can understand how this process works, and it allows, I think, volume to generate some capital for these exchanges so that they can then really begin to explore some of the more trend-setting or groundbreaking applications. So especially for a lot of these smaller financial jurisdictions, I think it's a fantastic first foray into this space.
Yeah, absolutely. But that ends the European segment. I am going to pass it over to you, Kyle, for our next stop on the tour in Africa. I understand that I think we actually need to take a boat for this one.
We're getting on a boat.
Looking forward to learning more.
We're taking some tiny islands here. We're starting with one of our favorites here on the show, Seychelles. Seychelles has their merge exchange, which currently has 31 traditional securities on the platform, and their total market cap is around $300 million. They did announce recently that they have plans to IPO later this year in the form of a security token offering. So they're really trying to consider how they can leverage this opportunity. Hopefully, if they can successfully IPO with a security token offering, they can then begin to transition to offering other security token offerings on their exchange. So they're certainly aware of this, but the degree in which they're actually providing these services yet, I think is we're not quite there yet.
I think we all remember Seychelles, and at the end of the day, they're taking advantage of the fact that they are in Africa, and more importantly, as a little tiny island. Really, they claim that they have the opportunity to really revamp the regulations to be the most conducive for security tokens. So very interesting to see what will happen there.
From there, we are moving to Mauritius. And Mauritius is honestly an island, Herwig, that I was not incredibly familiar with prior to doing this research.
But you were with Seychelles?
Certainly we've discussed Seychelles a few times throughout our 10 weeks. I certainly had not mentioned Mauritius before. I did need to look up how to pronounce Mauritius prior to this episode. But that being said, they're doing great work, so it should not hold them back at all. We see here that HYBSE and GMEX, they launched the international marketplace with the intention of trading tokenized securities. So this is a first option. I think a bunch of players in Mauritius are looking to leverage their joint capacities to be able to launch an exchange, hopefully to trade tokenized securities in the future. We also see there is a second security token exchange in Mauritius. This second one is called the Global Asset Exchange, and they announced themselves loudly in March of 2019, saying that they are developing an exchange out of Mauritius and are looking to leverage security tokens and offer those to investors. So 2 exchanges are very ambitious out of Mauritius and deserve all the applause in the world because there's a lot of barriers there in terms of their market cap and their GDP and the production there. But it's a tremendous opportunity for some of these small islands to successfully, be in the forefront.
Wow, two exchanges, one small island with, they do have a population of around 1.2 million. At the end of the day, Seychelles is a lot smaller, as I understand it. So it looks like there's a little bit more room for 2 here.
Yeah. So we'll see. Best of luck for those guys, and we're excited to see the progress that they make. Moving forward into the Caribbean, we have Jamaica. They launched their stock exchange. They put out a strong press pump that they are working with BlockStation to pilot to trade security tokens. So the first stage of the pilot included them, participating with registered broker dealers and market makers, and the Jamaica Central Securities Depository. And so they were trying to figure out how exactly all this stuff would work together. But according to their official announcement, the objective of the pilot was to demonstrate a complete life cycle of the digital asset ecosystem. And so they started with crypto. I think that they're looking to move forward into security tokens, but they're still working on it now, but they're doing a good job in terms of working with established players and going from there.
All right, Jamaica.
Moving forward into Curacao, we don't have a ton of information from Curacao other than we know that Comp Token, which is formed by Zeneca Group, has partnered with the Dutch Caribbean Stock Exchange in Curacao to list tokenized securities. So moving forward, that could be a great opportunity for issuers to be able to leverage the Dutch Caribbean Stock Exchange to be able to get some liquidity for their shares and be able to list successful security tokens in just another jurisdiction, which I think, again, highlights why it will be important to have all of these jurisdictions operate in collaboration, because we have a lot of these jurisdictions all around the world, big and small, from the US and the UK all the way to some of these smaller nations like Curacao or Seychelles. And so we need to make sure that everyone's okay with working together, and we set the standards that we can all follow such that many of these issuers from all around the world can have access to liquidity. But finally, we're going to another country here, Barbados. The Barbados Securities or Stock Exchange announced in early 2019 that it also has a partnership with BlockStation to help it build out support for security tokens. So we haven't heard any news since. We do see that BlockStation is really making big moves to work with many of these smaller nations to figure out how they can leverage security tokens in their exchange, in their countries, and be able to provide that to investors. So great for Barbados to be forward thinking, but we're looking forward to seeing a little bit more from them in terms of how that progress has looked so far. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Asia. We cannot forget about Asia. No way.
Gonna take us out of our tropical element here and go across the world here. All right.
If we know Asia has been a leader in the crypto markets, they certainly are very forward thinking technologically, and we are sure that they're making great moves with security tokens. We certainly are very aware of security tokens in all of Asia, and so starting with Singapore leads the region in activity. They have already greenlit an exchange by regulators in Singapore that's called One Exchange, that's planning to launch several offerings in Singapore. And there's actually another exchange in Singapore formed by a joint venture between Zilliqa and MyCoin, and it's called HG Exchange, and it's aiming to provide access to high-growth startups and also decacorns. So we've heard of this model before where they kind of provide secondary services for a lot of these large private companies. Examples that they state in their announcement include Uber, which is now no longer public, SpaceX, Grab, and Didi, which are currently not within reach of the average investor. And so they're doing a great job there, looking to list private companies and provide an exchange for them. Another exchange is called iStocks, and it's owned by ICHX, and it intends to be trading in 2020. And finally, one of the biggest cryptocurrency exchanges in the world, Wobi, which is also out of Singapore, did infer in July that they are very much inclined to enter into the security token trading under the Singapore jurisdiction. So just like Binance, another large exchange obviously is plugged into the space, certainly sees the immense opportunity in security tokens, but recognizes the regulation, that the steps that need to take action there. And they have indicated that they're interested, they're monitoring the space, and may be very likely to get involved.
A lot of activity out of Singapore, Kyle. I think that was 4 different exchanges you just mentioned. That's a lot.
Singapore is making some really, really good moves. Then we go to Philippines, and the Philippines, we have CEZEX, the CEZEX exchange based out of the Philippines, which is partnered with a Hong Kong broker-dealer to build one of the first security token exchanges in Asia. Currently, they are actually trading a digital gold token, which can be redeemed for 100 grams or 1,000 grams gold bars that they actually have in a vault. So they actually are trading what appears to be, Herwig, a real security token, in the sense of, when I was doing the research, it seems like if you own enough of this specific digital gold offering that they're providing on their platform, you're able to redeem that for a gold bar and show up in person and actually get your gold. And so this token is representative of some amount of real gold, and so they're also strongly planning to list many more security tokens moving forward. But as with many of these other exchanges on the list, there's a lot of regulatory clarity that needs to be established before that realistically can happen in terms of company equity or debt instruments or things like that. So good for SEZEX using a Hong Kong broker-dealer, which transitions us well into Hong Kong itself. Hong Kong, we have DigiNex, which is an institutional grade platform intending to facilitate exchange and custody of tokenized securities and is based out of Hong Kong. And so previously, regulators in Hong Kong told many of the crypto exchanges to delist security tokens. But in March of this year, they actually released guidelines to follow for security tokens and to make sure that you're compliant. And it appears that DigiNex now aims to be the new home for security tokens in Hong Kong, which is fantastic. And we look forward to seeing the advancements there. But we also see that in Hong Kong and Singapore, there's a lot of activity. China, we haven't seen quite as much security token-based activity there. So we're still looking and still very much paying attention to the space to see how this grows over time. But certainly there's a ton of activity in Asia still with ICOs and cryptos, especially with some of the large exchanges like Binance actually announcing that you can no longer participate as a U.S. investor. I think that goes live in about a week. So they're still very much into the crypto space and are slowly coming around to security tokens. And my end of the tour wraps up here with Australia. And Australia, from our news earlier down under, we know that the Australian Stock or Securities Exchange is also planning to be completely on-chain by 2021. So they're, as Herwig mentioned, they're looking to get a lot of this data on-chain through distributed ledger technology. And we'd expect that, considering this is their kind of the first step, it may be likely that in some way or another, tokenization of some of their equities or listing some tokenized equities or debt instruments may roll out moving forward. Maybe in the 2021, maybe 2022, somewhere in there, we can kind of expect to see Australia maybe take a look. I know that Australia is incredibly active on the ICO front and are incredibly bullish on blockchain in general. So it doesn't seem like a far stretch for me to see them getting into this industry once we start to see an increased amount of successful offerings and potentially secondary interest from other parts of the world.
Well, one would expect, Kyle, and I'm sure that we might see Australia, very big space. I'm sure we'll see more entrants come into that region as well. Now, finally, we do, I'll try to circle us back to the other side of the world here. And unfortunately, we weren't able to find any dedicated activity from a specific security token exchange planning to launch in Latin America as of right now. Certainly a lot of focus around crypto exchanges. We know that Tezos and BTG Pactual are doing big moves, and you have BR11, which is a security token. But at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like there is anything specific that we can comment to that yet. And circling us back to North America, I can say that in Canada, the Canadian Securities Exchange, they announced in February of 2019 that they plan to launch a new securities token platform, and they've been very, similar to the FCA, very forward thinking. They have a great sort of regulatory sandbox set up for all these issuances and security tokens to be able to go ahead and get listed. So we do have our eye on Canada as our neighbor here, because at the end of the day, it's outside of the U.S. So we could potentially see one of those easier correlations between two nations be Canada and the U.S. That ends our tour, at least as of right now. I'm sure we'll end up doing another kind of update segment, taking a look at all this activity down the road and see how much of them are on track. Maybe some that similarly get acquired, like block trade, or end up pivoting and doing something else. But I think it's worth commenting, Kyle, that even though we're seeing a lot of activity, none of them are live yet. It's clear that everyone's very bullish on the space. We see a trend that especially the more proactive jurisdictions are seeing a lot more activity, like the UK and Malta. And we're also seeing this trend of new regions, or let's call it jurisdictions that previously didn't have a strong capital markets to begin with, are looking at this new burgeoning technology, and they see it as an opportunity to get in the game and potentially even compete at the highest level. Just like we saw with Seychelles or Barbados or any of the islands that Kyle took us through, it certainly is clear they all see the same opportunity. And of course, those jurisdictions that are reacting more so than being proactive, that things are a little slower there. But at the end of the day, it can't be stopped. What is clear is around the world, everyone is looking at security tokens and recognizing the need for exchanges in the various jurisdictions and the opportunity by these entrepreneurs or by the existing national exchanges, which I think is another major trend to recognize. These are not all startups getting into the game, and further proof to us that here in the US we expect the same thing. We will see national exchanges go after this. Kyle, your thoughts on all this?
It's all very exciting. We're super early. But the reality is that it could be 2020 could be very interesting as all of these projects start to prop up. And we start to see a lot of these exchanges all around the world spending all this time fundraising and developing their technology and exploring the regulation and what they need to do to get this accomplished. Many of these exchanges all around the world will, I think, be ready around a similar time. And it's going to be an exciting opportunity when we really start to see the entire world connect in a way that has never been possible before. And I couldn't be more excited for what we're going to see moving forward. So anyone listening from all around the world, do what you can to move your local jurisdiction forward and participate and collaborate with everyone else, because this is a space where we're seeing a ton of collaboration from many countries all around the world, from many companies all around the world, and it's a great opportunity to get involved and to really make an impact locally and globally.
Really exciting. I think 2020 is for sure the year of the security token based on this information. We often like to say 2017, the year of the concept, 2018, the year everybody raised money to deploy, and in 2019 is that infrastructure year. So it's lining up right on track. 2020, the year of security tokens. Many exchanges will be live, many projects will be issued, lockups will be expired, and we're looking at exciting times ahead. That's all we have for the show. Thank you everyone for listening. As always, please send us your comments, feedback, and inquiries directly, or find us on any of our channels.
Talk to you next week.